The auto sector is one of those sectors which seemed badly battered at the start of the lockdown and COVID-19 and has been battered since then. But things have turned around for the auto sector. Perhaps it's an increased need for personal mobility due to the virus, or it is other factors that have come into play, but the auto sector has been on the mend. The same can't be said for many other sectors. So even as we kick off Budget 2021 coverage on the India development debate, today we're going to set our focus on the weakest in the link, the most vulnerable sectors, the ones that have been battered the most. Remember, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has promised a budget that hasn't been seen in the last 100 years. Will this never seen before budget focus on these sectors? Which are the ones we're talking about? Aviation is definitely one of them. Brutalized really because of COVID-19. Passenger loads are just about coming back into shape. But remember, there are caps for the aviation sector on what extent of fares they can charge. Restaurants definitely badly hit. Many have been moving to a delivery option, but is it really enough to keep them going? Jobs at risks. Tourism, transportation, hospitality, other sectors which will be confined till a vaccine really comes into play, till herd immunity plays out, people can move like they did pre-COVID-19, and that could be 18 to 24 months from now. Can they really survive that long? That's the conversation we're having this evening, and joining me on this is Dhruv Shingri. He's the co-founder and CEO of Yatri.com. I'm also speaking this evening with Anurag Katriar, the president of NRAI, that's the Restaurant Association. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for talking with us on the show this evening. Dhruv, let me begin with your take on the point that we're making, on how badly this industry has been hit. Let's talk about tourism and travel for just a bit. Towards the end of 2020, there were reports that people had started getting out. The formats may have changed, but it was more your Airbnb format or, private bungalows, villas. People were making weekend plans, weekend getaways. What has the recovery been like? Give us a clear picture of that to start off with.
Sure, Tamanna, and good evening to you and the viewers. See, the recovery out here has been a very slow and gradual one. As you well know, this sector has been at the forefront of bearing the brunt of the entire epidemic. So for the vast majority of last year, travel was at an extremely low ebb. And it's only in the last quarter, which is the October to December period, that we've begun to see the green shoots of recovery. If I look at domestic travel, domestic aviation has in fact recovered a bit more than the rest of the sectors. So domestic aviation today is hovering somewhere around the 65 to 70% mark of the pre-COVID numbers. So we are beginning to see some strength on the domestic aviation front. Domestic hospitality obviously has still been very badly hit, and there are pockets within it. So while you mentioned around some newer trends which are emerging, the vast majority of travel that's happened is happening in two buckets. One, to destinations like Goa, which are perennial favorites, or near home destinations. So people are preferring more shorter breaks. They're traveling maybe for 2 to 3 days at a time, and then increasing the frequency of those breaks because everyone's working from home. So you do have that flexibility of traveling more frequently, but they're preferring destinations which are nearer to home. The other trend that we've seen is that people are preferring now to stay in better quality hotels. I think it's driven to a certain extent by the scare, people's increased need for hygiene, safety, security, etc. So on the back of that, we are seeing people willing to spend a bit more to stay at 4 and 5 star hotels. Obviously, the prices of 4 and 5 star hotels is also lower at this point in time. So people are spending and going to these higher category properties. The one other thing which obviously is there when we look at travel, so travel is made up of two components. One is leisure travel, the other is business travel. So in a country like India, which is still an emerging economy, business travel constitutes the larger part of the spends. And business travel actually has pretty much been decimated. So today you're looking at business travel numbers being anywhere between 10 to 15% of pre-COVID levels. So while you'll see hotel recoveries happening in the more leisure destinations, the hotel properties which are in metros which are largely dependent on business travel, I think those are suffering very badly at this point in time. So it's a recovery which has seen some green shoots on the one hand with domestic aviation, and then you've got sectors like hotels, which are in the metro cities, which are still struggling. And obviously, international travel is still extremely, extremely low. I mean, that's all governed by the bubble agreements. So you've got maybe 3 or 4 destinations, which at this point in time are getting a bit of traction. So you've got Dubai, you've got Maldives, now you've got Sri Lanka opening up. But it's only a handful of destinations at this point for international travel. So the bulk of the travel is still domestically.
So, Dhruv, if you could just give me sort of a breakdown of this pie you've described. Your international leisure travel at one end, your business travel at the other, and then, of course, your domestic travel, which is just about beginning to revive, that too in the leisure category. So, out of the whole pie, what percentage do you think, or would you say approximately, has come back?
See, if I look at these pockets, so domestic aviation is around the 65%, so 2/3. Domestic hotels, leisure destinations would be closer to about 40 to 50%, depending on the destination. Business destinations, metros, hovering around 25 to 30%. International travel, about 10%. So depending on the nature and the other fourth sector, which India has historically relied on, which is inbound, which is foreigners coming into India, and for them October to March is the key period. That sector is pretty close to zero right now.
Yeah, of course. Related in a sense on that impact for tourists traveling and another sector which gets hit when people don't move around and go on holidays and spend money is of course the restaurant business. Anurag, Katriar, we've spoken quite a few times in the last many months, and there has been a slight improvement over time. Restaurants have allowed to be opened in most parts of the country now with your restrictions of 50% capacity, etc. How would you mark the recovery?
So first of all, good evening, Tamanna. Thank you so much for having me here once again. So, while restaurants have opened in most parts of the country and virtually every part of the country, the problem still exists around the operating hours. For example, in Mumbai, you are looking to shut down the restaurants at 11:30, which means you can operate dinner only for barely like about 50-60% of your usual business. So overall, but if you ask me for a number, I think we are hovering around 50% mark nationally. Some centers are doing little better than others. For example, Bangalore has shown some smarter recovery than, let's say, Bombay. But overall, yeah, we are looking at about 50%, which is okay. At least there is a beginning, but still far from where comfort will come in.
Okay, let's now move back to what is needed. And Anurag, let me come to you again.
Right.
A series of measures were announced by the government after the lockdown ended. They were aimed, some at specific sectors like real estate, etc., but many of them for small and medium businesses. Nothing too much specifically for the restaurant business. What do you think the restaurant business needs, and are you truly optimistic that there would be enough space in the FM's kitty, so to speak, to really give your sector a lifeline?
Well, I sincerely hope so. And hope for us is right now the biggest weapon and support system. And why do I say that? I'm sure FM is mindful of the fact that restaurant industry is the second largest employer of human capital. And it has seen the maximum mortality, one of the largest mortality rates across every sector. I reckon if 30% of the restaurants have shut down and others are operating at reduced capacity, probably we are already about 40% of our workforce, which is about 7 odd million, have already been rendered jobless. And this is where we need support. And I am hoping, we have already made representation to the Honorable Finance Minister, and I am hoping for basically threefold relief, if I may say. First is for our survival. And what is causing the high mortality is lack of financial resources for the restaurants to survive this, what I call a low phase. I'm fairly optimistic from the third quarter of the next fiscal. We will start seeing consumption going on the higher trajectory. But how do we survive till then? People are shutting down because they don't have resources. If the government, if the finance minister can nudge the banks and other financial institutions to extend some liquidity to the sector, and considering it's a very stressed sector right now, at a little lower interest rates with some decent amount of moratoriums, that will help us survive. Now for revival, I think we require a couple of measures from the finance minister, which we are hoping she will bring in. One of them is around rationalizing the GST. As you know, I mean, currently the GST rate for restaurant across the sector, which is ranging from a cart to a five-star hotel, is 5%. And unfortunately, we are the only sector where input tax credit is not allowed. The reason for that was that there are lots of unorganized players who may have to bear the, they may not be able to deal with the compliances related to GST. So what we have proposed in our letter to the finance minister is to make it slab-wise. People who are doing, let's say, I'm just throwing a number, a business up to 1.5 crores, put them under composite scheme. People who are doing an annual turnover of, say, 7.5 crores, which is 1 or 2 restaurants, you keep them in the current rate of 5% with no input tax credit. But for the larger organized sector, you please increase the rate and allow input tax credit, because not only is it hurting our operating parameters, our cost of capital is going up with every new project. It is going up by something as high as 20%. And that is why that rationalization is something which is our major request from the finance minister. And we are absolutely hoping that she'll bring it in her budget speech. And last but not the least, I think if India has to move to a 5 trillion economy that we have been talking about, it may look a little far. I think e-commerce has to play a big role, and e-commerce in food service has to play a very significant role. Currently, I think the e-commerce policy for the food service sector is not very well defined. I think time has come to bring about a very structured e-commerce policy for the food service sector, because that can lead to very exponential growth in the sector, which will help the economy overall. So I think, if I have to put it in very simple buckets, please give us liquidity, please rationalize GST, and get me a good, robust, equitable e-commerce policy.
Let me go across to Dhruv. And from an industry perspective, Dhruv, what really will allow the industry to survive? I was reading a report from the Hotel Association, which claims that 4 out of 10 hotel rooms are on the brink of disappearing if there is no lifeline, if there is no aid. Is the situation truly that dire, and what could be the impact if there is no help? I was also seeing, for example, and I digress a little, pardon me here, on how several countries are now incentivizing people to go out and spend. They're giving them tax credits, they're giving them, fiscal incentives really, that if you go out and you book a hotel room in an area close to you or in your state or in your neighborhood, then you will get some benefit out of it. Do you think we need a scheme like that?
Absolutely. I think, Tamanna, you hit the nail on the head. The key thing is to put more money into the hands of the consumer. I think we definitely will have a demand side issue. And if that demand side issue is not resolved in the coming budget, you will see that 4 out of 10, whether it's 4 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 5 out of 10, whatever that number might be, but a very meaningful amount of players, number of players in this category could potentially go down. So I think creating an incentive structure, and we've raised this concern and raised this request on a number of occasions, maybe putting in place an LTA kind of scenario where for the next year you get a tax break if you spend, let's say, 50,000 to 100,000 rupees on domestic travel. Similarly, from a company's point of view, if they do a large event in a hotel in their neighborhood or in their near vicinity, they get a tax break on that spend. So creating those kinds of incentives, and UK is a classic example where they've done this for dining out. There are other countries which are doing it for accommodation and stay. I think those kinds of fiscal measures are really needed at this point in time to stimulate demand. So you've got the demand side equation on one hand. Then you've got the regulatory aspects as well, and especially, at a time like this, we introduced last year compliance and extra compliance like TDS and TCS on the online players. Now, the online players are the ones which are really there at this point in time, and a vast majority of people have moved online. So to add that extra burden of compliance at a time like this is, I think, really uncalled for. So we would look for some relief on that front as well. And then supporting the inbound industry. I think that's the industry which is really challenged at this point in time. There is an existing SEIS scheme which is in place, and that scheme rewards for foreign exchange earnings. However, payments under that scheme have been running delayed. There is little clarity at this point in time around the future of that scheme. So putting out those kinds of measures which will clearly help articulate the government's plan as well will give clarity and provide a roadmap to a lot of people in this industry. I mean, this is, after all, the largest employer in the country, right? We're talking about 6 to 7% of GDP being contributed by the travel and tourism industry. So I think providing the necessary support, both from a demand side and on some structural reform, is extremely important. I think the point around liquidity into the sector that Anurag made is a very important one. While it holds true for restaurants, it does, extend itself and lend itself to the hospitality sector and the tourism sector in general too. Because while the government, on the one hand, came out in March, April timeframe talking about moratoriums and talking about extra support, on ground, what has happened is that the banks have pretty much curtailed their exposure to these sectors. So you've got a double whammy that's happening at this point in time, that at a time when liquidity is more needed and more structural support is needed, you're finding the banks actually pulling back. So I think the actual implementation of what the finance minister has been talking about on the ground is also extremely important, right? It's easy to have, words put out there, but the execution on the ground really needs to be pushed through as well this time around.
Yeah, no, that's important because a lot of schemes have been announced to bolster what is the small and medium sector, the MSMEs, and a lot of players in these two sectors which we're discussing today would fall in that category. But are they really getting the aid? We'll also give you one more aspect of why it's important to focus on these sectors which we're calling the most vulnerable, because they're also the highest employers. In the travel and tourism sector, there's an estimate that maybe over 5 crore jobs may have been lost. Real estate, another sector which employs a large number of people, the same with hotels and restaurants, etc. So if we need to get the jobs back, the spending power back, we have to go ahead and make sure these sectors, these jobs and these businesses actually survive till enough people get the vaccine and can be mobile once more. I want to thank the two of you for joining us in the discussion this evening.